is a lecture by Mr. Maritain, and this one is called Art for the People, and we'll have an intermission after approximately an hour.
In the second part of our last meeting, we considered the problem of the responsibility of the artist to men from the point of view of the artist and of his own conscience. I should like to add, in relation to the saying of François Mauriac, to purify the source, on which I laid stress, that this maxim refers especially to writers. No doubt it matters in one sense to all artists, painters or composers as well as poets, inasmuch as they should, as men and as every man, be concerned with their own spiritual good and their own progress toward the perfection of human life. And when the source becomes purer in them, by the same stroke, their work itself will convey higher and larger human values. Will the work have also greater artistic value? Will it be artistically better or worse? That's a problem, a melancholy problem, which I shall try to tackle in my last lecture. But Mauriac's saying is directed especially to writers and poets, and more especially to novelists. It is especially when it comes to writers that the maxim to purify the source imposes itself in relation to the impact of the work on the moral life and standards of other men and on the moral health of the community, and in relation to the possibly vivifying and salutary or possibly degrading and corrupting influence of the work. For the writer works with words which convey ideas and stir imagination, and which act through intelligence on all the rational and emotional fabric of notions and beliefs, images and passions and instincts on which the moral life of man depends. In my present discussion, I shall also have especially in view the case of the writer. But I shall not consider the problem from the point of view of the artist and his own conscience, as I did in the latest lecture. I shall consider it from the point of view of the other fellow, the point of view of the public, the point of view of the human community. Here we are confronted no longer with the motto, art for art's sake, but with an opposite motto which appeals today to many sociologically minded or politically minded or humanitarian persons, in which is the motto, art for the people, or art for the community. I am aware of the fact that such a formula may only relate to the intentions of an artist who is inspired by generous human purposes, while his virtue of art is genuinely at play for the good of the work, especially to the intentions of an artist who is eager to have the joys of beauty made available not only to a privileged class, but to the underprivileged as well. Such desire corresponds, I think, to a basic need and necessity. But let me observe parenthetically that it is best fulfilled when an artist is more concerned with future generations and the spiritual community of mankind as a whole than with the common people of his own time. And when, on the other hand, the great works of art, once created, are made available to all by offering them to all through the channel of libraries, museums, and other modern media of communication, and by making all members of the community capable of enjoying them thanks to liberal education for all. All that is the job of the community, not of the artist himself. As a matter of fact, the attempts to put creative activity itself at the service of the common people have generally been a failure. Well, if the motto art for the people is understood in the way I just mentioned, I have no grudge against it. But as it is used in actual fact, this motto relates to the exigencies of those who speak in the name of the human community and who want to raise the needs or ideals of the community to a rule of creation imposed on the very making of the work. In this sense, just as art for art's sake simply disregards the world of morality and the values of human life, and the fact that an artist is a man, so the motto art for the people or art for the social community simply disregards the world of art itself and the values of the creative intellect and the fact that an artist is an artist. It is true that art finally serves the good of the human community in a deep and mysterious sense that I shall try to indicate at the end of this lecture. But the error consists in misunderstanding and misusing this true notion and believing accordingly that the social or moral value of the work must enter the very sphere of the making as its supreme standard. At this point, a little more searching analysis does not seem irrelevant. I have said that any human intention or purpose whatsoever may incite the artist on the condition that the straight movement of his art toward the work does not deviate, and that his art is strong enough to keep its autonomy in its own sphere. How is this possible? How can art's autonomy remain intact under such an incitation? In two ways, I think. Either because the human end intended remains completely extrinsic to the domain of art's activity, as the wages are for a worker, or the royalties for a writer, or success for any artist. Or because that which moves the artist is fully integrated to his own creative subjectivity and creative experience. I would say that what we call in French la commande, the fact of the artist being commissioned to do a certain task by some patron, prince, or wealthy art fancier, falls within the first case. Here we have a problem posed to the artist from the outside. It delimits the subject matter, but only the creative activity of the artist solves this problem. Paul Valéry asserted that nothing would please him more than being commissioned to write a poem of a given number of lines, or even of words, or even of letters. Under similar circumstances, the craftsmanship of a watchmaker would display all its power. And Valéry dreamed of being a perfect watchmaker. In the other case, when the poet obeys an idea or a passion which is dear to him, especially a passion or an idea as remote in itself from spiritual creativity as a social idea or a social passion, there is a risk involved, because such a passion or idea, while taking part in the operation of art, remains as long as it has not been integrated in creative experience or intuitive emotion. It remains a factor external to art, and thus risks superseding the requirements of art or preying upon them. Thus it is that it is bad luck, as a rule, for a poet to become a national poet, though in certain instances good poems were written under the fire of national or even political passion. But in these instances, the passion in question had been internalized in the creative source, integrated in the poetic intuition, and therefore transmuted. For then it becomes poetic knowledge. There is no longer a passion or an idea participating in the management of the making. There is poetic knowledge inspiring all the management of the making. And this is all the truer, as we have to do with more universal and all-pervading passions, ideas or beliefs, religious, philosophical, metaphysical, or with the unified intellectual and cultural universe that a Dante, a Donne, or a Shakespeare carried in their minds. All these human riches were in them when they worked in the state of creative fire or creative intuition. I would submit that in the two cases, the two extreme cases I have just distinguished, only the virtue of art commands, and there is nothing which breaks in. In the first case, because the end intended by the artist or the conditions imposed upon him remain entirely outside. In the second case, because the human impulse or motion does not need to enter. It is in from the start. being one with the creative intuition which animates the virtue of art and passes through it, in which all the rules of the making have to obey. Then the autonomy of art is not impaired. It is, on the contrary, increased and fortified, for the influence exercised on it is like that of the sun and the climate on a plant, and the motion it receives acts from within and passes into it in the manner of an inspiration. But the theory of art for this social group is not concerned with such problems, nor with the notion of the autonomy of art. It simply ignores this autonomy. It makes the social value or social significance or social impact of the work into an aesthetic or artistic value, even the supreme aesthetic or artistic value. According to this theory, a good which is not the good of the work, but a certain good of human life, is made into the very object, essential and intrinsic, determining and specifying of the very virtue of art. One believes that the work must be ruled and shaped and brought into being, not with regard to the creative intuition in which it originates and to the rules of making which it calls for, but with regard to some moral or social requirement to be satisfied. One believes that the work must be immediately touched and attained in its very making by judgments and determinations which depend not on the virtue of art, but on emotions, purposes, or interests of the moral or social order. To this very extent, art is warped and bent to the service of a master who is not its only genuine master, namely the work, its true object, in the service of which it achieves its own inalienable freedom. Art for this social group becomes thus inevitably propaganda art. What the existentialist fashion calls today the engaged art, l'art engagé, we might say as well the enlisted art or the drafted art, is inevitably propaganda art, either for moral or anti-moral, social, political or philosophical, religious or anti-religious purpose. An artist who yields to this craving for regimentation fails by the same token in his gifts, in his calling, and in his proper virtue. Art, like knowledge, is appendant to values which are independent of the interests, even the noblest interests of human life, for they are values of the intellectual order. André Gide was wrong, to be sure, when he said, you remember perhaps this passage which I quoted in my first lecture, when he said that the artist is expected to appear after dinner. his function is not to provide food, but intoxication. That is not true. Poets do not come on the stage after dinner to provide with the intoxication of pleasures which are of no consequence, ladies and gentlemen previously satiated with terrestrial food. But they are not either waiters who provide them with the bread of existentialist nausea, Marxist dialectics, or traditional morality, the beef of political realism or idealism, and the ice cream of philanthropy. They provide mankind with a spiritual food, which is intuitive experience, revelation, and beauty. For man, as I said in my youth, is an animal who lives on transcendentals. Plato, the Plato of the Republic, held the poets to be deceptive imitators of imitations, pernicious to the city, its truths and its morals. At least he was fair to them in expelling them from the state. He knew that poetry, as long as it remains poetry, will never and can never become an instrument of the state. Yet, the theory of art for the social community, which I just criticized, arose as a matter of fact from the very excesses of the theory of art for art's sake. The system and practice of the complete irresponsibility of the artist, who writes freely only if he is sure that it does not matter what he writes, runs, as we have seen, against the grain of nature. A reaction from the social community was inevitable. People cannot indefinitely bear to have their basic standards and beliefs mocked or ruined, their moral heritage threatened, their own minds confused, or their imaginations poisoned for the sake of the artist's irresponsibility. These reactions can be dull and queer, Philistine, misguided, or simply coarse. They are a phenomenon of natural, so to speak, biological defense. Some years ago, I read in a French newspaper that the workers in a printing office refused to print the manuscript of one of our most talented writers, a man whose prose is impeccable, because they were disgusted with its brazen immorality. Such a spontaneous reaction seems to me to be quite symptomatic. I wonder, nevertheless, whether a spontaneous censorship by the printers, if it were to spread, would be better, both with respect to art itself and finally to the common good, than any other censorship. Indeed, if we give free rein to our imagination, may we not visualize in a kind of a nightmare the possibility of a more general phenomenon, namely a revolt of the so-called common man against the intelligentsia at large, whose irresponsible achievements have put everything in jeopardy. Let us kill the physicists with their atom bomb, the biologists with their biological warfare, the philosophers with their babel of queries, the professors with their atomizing of human brains, the newspapermen with their maddening thrills, the modern painters with their rabid distortions, the modern novelists and poets with their "it does not matter what we write." There was something of such a revolt against intelligence and yearning for barbarism in a certain worshipping of life and toadyism of the people in Nazi Germany. The kind of nightmare I just imagined has no chance of becoming a reality. Not, I think, because people lack the resentment involved, but because they lack, fortunately, the power of satisfying it in this way. Yet a worse reality can confront mankind. People have no power, but the totalitarian state does have power to make sure the control of morality, its own peculiar morality, over the workings of the intellect, especially over art and poetry. I need not insist on the situation which everybody knows of art and poetry in Soviet Russia. They are accountable to the state, controlled by the state, subservient to the state. Even so great a poetess as Akhmanova was finally forced to yield. Even silence is impossible. The artist and the poet have a primary moral obligation toward politics. They must be politically minded, and they must support wholeheartedly the political truth of the passing moment. They must also comply with the aesthetic needs and tenets of the people as infallibly interpreted by the state or by the party. What an inviting example of engaged, dead engaged art. It matters what they write, but it does not matter to their conscience. It matters to the state. The function of the artist is to concoct according to state recipes and serve up hot dishes of moral and political education with aesthetic appetizers to co-regimented workers. The state does not expel the artist, as Plato naively wanted. It domesticates him. Is there then a solution to the problem? There is, I believe. And here, as in all other instances, we are not condemned to choose between anarchism and totalitarianism. But this solution cannot sweep away any possibility of tension and conflict. On the contrary, it makes capital out of them, as whenever two freedoms meet and have to adjust to one another. As concerns the human community, we have to recognize that freedom of expression and freedom of art are not those absolute and limitless divine rights which 19th century anarchistic liberalism enthroned. They are natural rights in the sense that they answer natural aspirations of thought and creative activity. But they are not absolute and limitless in nature. It is not true that every thought or artifact as such, as poisonous as it may be, has, because of the mere fact that it was born from a human mind, an absolute right to be displayed in the human community. As Thomas Aquinas put it, if an art produces objects which men cannot use without committing sin, idols for idolatry, for instance. Or he might have said, if he had lived in the time of La Marquise de Brinvilliers, poisonous bouquets for murder. It is but normal to make the trade of idols or of poisoned bouquets impossible. Yet it is with the art of the writer that we are dealing, and writers do not contrive, at least as the specific object of their art, idols or poisoned bouquets. Writers are concerned with ideas, and they communicate ideas. So it is necessary to go more closely into the question. Let us read for this purpose Article 19 in the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man proclaimed by the United Nations some years ago. I think that this article was written by some exceedingly shrewd or exceedingly lucky jurist, for it appears simple and self-evident, and yet it implies an unexpressed, though quite serious, no, concealed behind a strong and glorious yes. This article reads, quite simple, quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without of frontiers," unquote. The right to impart ideas. All the shrewdness, the unexpressed no together with the ringing yes, is concentrated in this word, ideas. Freedom to impart or spread ideas is one with freedom of research and thought, which is a natural right of the mind, and manifests the superior dignity of thought with respect to the social community. But freedom to impart ideas is not freedom to undertake or exercise actions. For actions can be repressed if they tend to destroy the foundations of life in common. It is obvious that the social community has a right to defend itself against such actions. For instance, an attempt to overthrow freedom by violence or to organize crime and murder. Such distinction is obvious and necessary, but its application is not without risks and difficulties. For the use of ideas can itself aim at action. At this point, we must be quite careful in our analysis. I am not referring to the fact that all great ideas, even and first of all, the most abstract and theoretical ideas, are laden with dynamite and a tremendous implicit power of action. It is so with philosophical systems, with the successive scientific images of the world, with great literary works. If by reason of this fact and by reason of the practical consequences that can be expected from a work, the social group had a right to forbid a man to impart his ideas, freedom of expression would simply vanish. It is on such grounds that Socrates was condemned, and that Frederick the Great turned an indignant eye on Kant's categorical imperative, for it was of a nature to lead his grenadiers astray. Let it be noted parenthetically that such behavior of social authority is but logical in the Marxist theory, according to which thought is, by nature, praxis or action. The distinction I am pointing out does not refer to the greater or less power of action which is involved in an idea. It refers to the fact that the use of ideas corresponds to two obviously distinct functions. Either the use of ideas is busy with searching after knowledge or expressive or creative experience, and then it belongs to the field of thought or idea proper. Or the use of ideas is busy with bringing about, here and now, a given practical effect, and then it belongs to the field of action and incitation to action. Hence, inevitable conflicts. Suppose that a political lunatic publishes pamphlets in which he advocates the mass murder of Jews or the destruction of incurable people who are a burden for the community. This was not an hypothetical example at the time of Nazi Germany, and Mr. Selin is still called a writer. Or suppose that a religious lunatic prints papers inciting his fellow sectarians to collective suicide. This was not an inconceivable example at the time of the All Believers sect in Russia. These men will claim freedom to express and impart their ideas. Well, but the social community and its various groups are directly interested in those incitations to action, and they would be foolish not to oppose those incitations to action by some appropriate means which will not involve open censorship if this community hates the very name, or will reduce censorship to the strictest possible minimum, but which will be efficacious for all that. How difficult and risky in application as it may be, the distinction is grounded on reality and is necessary. When it comes to the moral or immoral value of a literary work, it is inasmuch as this work is an incitation to action that the community may have to defend its moral standards against it. The problem is simple in the case of the products of pornographic industry. They deal with conditioned reflexes, not with ideas. But it becomes quite entangled when it is a question of literary works properly said, in which either a hope to awaken some unavoidable complicity or an open disregard of accepted standards is involved, either in a more or less spurious or in a genuine or even superior creativity. We cannot deny that people who are not specialists in literature have a right to be warned against reading Le Marquis de Sade or Jean Genet. On the other hand, we cannot deny that the attempts of the state to condemn Les Fleurs du Mal or Madame Bovary or any other great work are themselves condemned to failure and succeed chiefly in making the state look ridiculous. The fact remains that under the angle and for the reasons I have tried to make clear, certain limitations to the exercise of freedom of expression are both inevitable in actual existence and justifiable in themselves. But the only reason for these limitations is the common good of the human community. And because this common good is the common good of human persons, it implies as an essential part the respect for the intellectual values dealing with truth or beauty, which are supra-political in nature, the respect for freedom of inquiry, which is a basic right of the human person, and the respect for the inner energies of intelligence and conscience, which are the mainsprings of social and political life, and which cannot be coerced, but can adhere only to what they have good reasons to believe true. The common good is ruined if the human community ignores these three kinds of respect. As a result, it is in the very name of the common good that any limitations which may legitimately be brought to bear on freedom of expression or freedom of art should always respect the basic freedom and dignity of the intellect and be calculated to foster, not impair them. Shall I indicate briefly some of the practical conclusions which derive from this principle? Let us remember, first, the distinction which must be made between the social community on the one hand and the state on the other. The state is but a part, the topmost part, but a part of the social community or the body politic. And the effort to protect the human society from the pernicious actions or incitations to action possibly conveyed by a work is, in my opinion, the job of the social community more than of the state. The first responsibility rests on the social community as distinct from the state. The first way for the human community to confront the possible drawbacks resulting from freedom of expression and freedom of art is education, equipping the minds with vital powers of resistance, criticism, and discrimination. In the second place, there is the spontaneous pressure of the common consciousness and public opinion, springing from the national ethos when it is firmly established. In the third place, there is the pressure which results from the fact that large groups of citizens may warn their members against reading a book or seeing a movie picture, even if it is a question of great works, for everything depends here on the moral standards, the intellectual preparation, and the degree of moral solidity and the age of the strata of population involved. And in the fourth place, there is the activity of the various private groups and organizations, which, freely starting from the bottom and uniting on the one hand readers or listeners, on the other writers or speakers, should develop as regards the use of the media of mass communication a ceaseless process of self-regulation, as well as a growing sense of responsibility. In a society in which common consciousness is provided with adequate organs, no Julius Streicher or Céline could print his incitations to murder without provoking so powerful a reaction that no publisher would dare sell or publish them again. As regards now the state, its right, which cannot be denied, to intervene in the field of artistic creativity and of the expressions of thought, demands, I think, to be applied in a most limited way. And since the common agreement on the basic tenets of a free society is itself merely practical, the criterion for any interference of the state should be of a merely practical, not ideological nature. The more extraneous this criterion is to the very content of thought or to the inner value of the work, the better it will be. It is too much for the state, for instance, to judge whether a work of art is possessed of an intrinsic quality of immorality. Then it would condemn Baudelaire or Joyce. It is enough for it to judge whether an author or a publisher plans to make money in selling obscenities. With such restrictions, why such restrictions on the exercise of the rights of the state? Only because it seems to me the fact is that the state is not equipped to deal with matters of intelligence. Each time the state disregards these basic truths, intelligence is victimized. And since intelligence has always its revenge, it is the social body and the human community which, one way or another, are victimized in the end. Finally, among the various external means we are now considering, the function exercised by free discussion and criticism is the most natural one. For it is with the very freedom and of expression, of thought, and of artistic activity that it counteracts the possible drawbacks of the latter. At this point, I would like to emphasize that the literary critic and the creative writer are in reality the same person in two different functions. A critic in science or in philosophy is a scientist or a philosopher. A critic in poetry is a poet, sometimes paralyzed as to the creative work by an excessive development of the reflective faculties, but fundamentally a poet. Thus, in criticism, we have art itself freely and rationally discussing and regulating art. And criticism has a double function. First, to judge of the work for the sake of art and aesthetic values. And second, to point out for the sake of the human community the moral implications contained in the work. Thomas Aquinas warned teachers never to dig in the path of the student a ditch that you fail to fill up. The same can be said of critics with respect to the reader. The task of genuine criticism is a task of ceaseless purification and enlightenment. First, as regards the creative activity itself of the artist. Second, as regards the common consciousness of the people. Thus, the key to our problem as concerned the possible interference of the social community restricting from the outside the free expression of literary or artistic activity, or more exactly, the free circulation of its products. The key through some spontaneous pressure or even through more or less coercive means. The key to our problem is a true sense of the common good and of the respect for intelligence and conscience that are the common good, that the common good basically requires. Now, I should like to point out that this true sense of the common good has, with regard to art and poetry, and now I am speaking of art in general, not only of literature, much wider and far-reaching implications. For a true sense of the common good understands that art and poetry, though, or rather, because they deal with an object independent in itself of the rules and standards of human life in the human community, play an essential and indispensable part in the existence of mankind. Man cannot live a genuine human life except by participating to some extent in the suprahuman life of the spirit, or of what is eternal in him. He needs all the more desperately poets and poetry, and they keep aloof from the sad business and standards of the rational animals' maintenance and guidance, and give testimony to the freedom of the spirit. It is precisely to the extent to which poetry is useless and disengaged that poetry is necessary, because it brings to men a vision of reality beyond reality, an experience of the secret meanings of things, an obscure insight into the universe of beauty, without which men could neither live nor live morally. For, as St. Thomas put it, nobody can live without delectation. That's why he who is deprived of the spiritual delectations goes over to the carnal. And St. Teresa of Avila used to say that even for contemplatives, if there were no poetry, life would not be tolerable. Leave then the artist to his art. He serves the community better than the engineer or the tradesman. At this point, I should like to quote a passage in Shelley's Defense of Poetry. After having claimed, which seems quite questionable, that, quote, the greatest poets have been men of the most spotless virtue, unquote. Shelley cannot help realizing that such has not always been the case. Then he projects himself through an oratorical movement to the opposite extremity, in the manner of a concession to the vulgar. Quote, let us for a moment, he says, stoop to the arbitration of popular breaths. Let us assume that Homer was a drunkard, that Virgil was a flatterer, that Horace was a coward, that Tasso was a madman, that Lord Bacon was a peculator, that Raphael was a libertine, that Spencer was a poet laureate. It is inconsistent with this division of our subject to cite living poets, but posterity has done ample justice to the great names now referred to. Their errors have been weighed and found to have been dust in the balance. If their sins were as scarlet, they are now white as snow. They have been washed in the blood of the mediator and redeemer, time. Unquote. A poet who counted upon this kind of redeemer for his own salvation would be strangely mistaken. Time is not the redeemer of the poet's soul, but in one sense it is indeed the redeemer of the poet's work. In this sense, I think Shelley is right, and he forces us to confront a great truth. I would say that the common good of mankind is as indifferent as art itself is to the personal destiny of the poet and to his good, temporal or eternal, as a man. Let him incur damnation if only his work enriches the spiritual treasure of the world. The poet is alone, alone with God, as every man is, in the management of his own destiny. Neither his art nor the generations which will live on him are of any help. In the realm of the earthly destiny of the work, in the realm of the world or of civilization, not only are the sins of poets washed in the blood of time, but also the possibly sinful impact of their works. As I remarked in a previous discussion, the statues of Greek gods wound no longer human souls with the arrows of idolatry. They have lost their magical or bewitching power. Only beauty remains. In poems like those of Baudelaire, for instance, or in the novels in which Proust makes an ambiguous confession, the moral impact through which human souls may possibly be wounded is blurred and progressively extinguished by time. Only some deeper revelation of the heart of man remains. The clearest result of the work of Baudelaire, for instance, has been to turn modern poetry toward the universe of the spirit and to awaken in men a theological sense. Here again, Shelley was right in insisting that, quote, whatever strengthens and purifies the affections, enlarges the imagination, and adds spirit to sense is useful, unquote. Useful with the utility of what is beyond utility. And Shelley has written also, quote, all high poetry is infinite. It is as a first acorn, which contained all oaks potentially. Veil after veil may be undrawn, and the inmost naked beauty of the meaning never exposed. A great poem is a fountain forever overflowing with the waters of wisdom and delight, and after one person and one age has exhausted all its divine effluence, which their peculiar relations enable them to share, another and yet another succeeds, and new relations are ever developed, the source of an unforeseen and unconceived delight, unquote. I would submit that, as concerns the final contribution of art to the common good of the human race, not only in relation to the fact that man cannot do without poetry, but also in relation to the progress of moral conscience itself. What essentially matters is the depth of the creative experience, the depth of the creative source. For in the long run, any deeper awareness of what is hidden in man turns to a greater enlightenment of moral conscience. Here we are confronted with the most real and mysterious sense in which art serves the community in its very freedom from the interests of the social group. With respect to the perfection of life of the poet himself and to the immediate moral impact of his work, Mauriac's saying holds true, and the only way is to purify the souls. But with respect to that final impact on the common good of mankind, of which we are now speaking, it is not the purity of the souls, it is rather its depth. It is the inner depth of the experience from which it springs, which is of primary importance in actual fact. This explains perhaps why Scarlett as the sins of a poet may have been, odious perhaps as he may have been as a man. We love him nevertheless because he was a poet, and we are grateful to him not only as lovers of beauty but also as men concerned with the mystery of their own destiny. And he is white as snow to our eyes in his work. In any case, we do not have to judge him. God will work it out with him somehow or other. To finish this lecture, I have a few words to add. Theorists in aesthetics are usually concerned with the role of art in reference to the human community. But they should also be concerned with the role of the human community in reference to art. Since the community needs art and the artist, the community has certain duties towards them. Just as a writer must be responsible, so the community must be. In actual fact, what the artist, the poet, the composer, the playwright expects from his fellow men as a normal condition of development for his own effort, is to be listened to, I mean intelligently, to get a response, I mean active and generous, to have them cooperate with him in this way, and to feel himself in a certain communion with them, instead of being confined, as happens today so often, in an intellectual ghetto. This means that the primary duty of the human community toward art is to respect it and its spiritual dignity, and to be interested in its living process of creation and discovery. Parenthetically, I'm always surprised when I read the New York Times to the special title for arts and the amusements. It is no more easy nor arbitrary to judge of a work of art than to judge of a work of science or philosophy. A work of art conveys to us as the first condition for such a judgment is a kind of previous consent to the intentions of the artist and to the creative perspectives in which he is placed. In judging of the artistic achievements of their contemporaries, people have a responsibility, both toward the artist and toward themselves, insofar as they need poetry and beauty. They should be aware of this responsibility.